talking about Paul now, and I'm like, man, what about the rest of the guys? But that's the story we have. So let's kind of walk through it a little bit. It's a pretty simple narrative, these 2 or 3 chapters or so. Paul gets up, he's going to Jerusalem. He tries to get told not to. They're like, you sure you want to? Remember, he is compelled by the Holy Spirit, which is one of the critical things to note about Paul. Is that he's, obviously this incredible teacher and evangelist and also apologist for the Christian faith, but he's also this, very devout and motivated instrument of God. And he never says no. And you think just for a moment, which I'm just thinking of, water because of the rain and Jonah, or how many other prophets throughout the Old Testament try to say, hold on, God, how about this? Or they just said no, or in any number of situations, right? And yet Paul very dutifully says yes, even under the face of often far worse pressure or persecution than some of the Old Testament figures too. Now, a more exciting summary that I thought, just to sort of paint the picture a little bit more fun, right, is you've got some riots and trials and a secret plot, which is always exciting. Paul is rather clever. There's some interesting wordplay and different language choice that helps, and he kind of outmaneuvers a couple of different sort of foes, if you will. He kind of pits the Sanhedrin and amongst the people, part of the Sanhedrin, he kind of pits them against each other, which is kind of humorous. The Romans, are sort of in a panic at the mob that is coming. And then Paul's nephew, this kind of little kid, gets to have this dramatic saving, actor, the role he plays. And through all of it, of course, is God's divine providence. Throughout, the entire history of Scripture, of course, is the hand of God, and this is certainly no less true here. Which, of course, leads to Rome. In a similar tone of that, I was thinking about sort of the whole sequence where he arrives and he's giving his long speech and he gives, his second retelling of his conversion story from way back, 15 chapters or so before. And you think for just a second how he is sort of dragged in and accused and asked all these questions of what is happening. And you could just think for a moment of how, he's come here to bring some relief to his friends. He's not trying to spark a rebellion, and yet, that's sort of the accusation, levied against him. It just seems to me a little bit humorous. Now, we should clarify what he's actually accused of, because it's a little bit similar to a court of law that we would have today, where he has specific charges brought up against him, similar, of course, to Jesus himself, which is one of the parallels of this story that we'll see in just a second, that it pretty closely mirrors Jesus' own sequence of being brought before Pontius Pilate, and then, of course, led to his death. Paul obviously doesn't get dragged away to his own death here, but some of the steps leading up to it very closely mirror it. So primarily he's accused of teaching against sort of Jewish law and Jewish thought that goes against, the book of the law of Moses. And of course, all Paul is doing is saying Christ died and Christ rose from the dead and he is the Son of God. Which, of course, as a Christian is the most obvious and most important claim, but to the Jews, anyone claiming to be God is obviously at odds with them, right? He gets accused of bringing in some, non-Jews into the temple, which is fair, right? And it's similar to the accusations that are levied against Stephen, which in a sort of full circle moment, of course, Paul was there present too. So he might have, even himself, have a little deja vu moment of, gosh, I was the one doing this back then too. And one of the things we see in Paul's own life, in his conversion to Christianity, is that his whole self is converted over. But more so, it's this conversion sort of away from this Jewish legalistic situation, if you will, which is important to know. Okay. One of the fun things, though, is, typically we think of the Romans as sort of antagonists within this early part of the life of the church. For the first 300 years of the Christian witness, Christianity is illegal within the Roman Empire. But here, in a sort of kind of fun twist of fate, they are the very ones that saved Paul's life. They're the ones that, keep him safe when there's this plot of 40 guys that, are banding together to try to kill him. They're the ones that help him. Throughout the story, though, this isn't the first time. It's happened at least 3 other times. And this is kind of a cool depiction of what part of the steps might have looked like leading up to the fortress. The temple is nearby, which you can see here. Obviously not this is a computer-generated image, but just to sort of paint in our mind sort of the context and how close these 2 places were. And that's, sort of the path that he gets led up to by the Roman soldiers. But one of the things that certainly stands out to me, and hopefully jumped out to you too, is of course when they're shouting away with him. I mean, you have to be picturing, during the Passion narrative, especially from Luke's Gospel, when they're saying, literally the same thing, quite literally the same verbiage. Matthew and Mark's accounts, they highlight crucify him, but in Luke's has the exact same language of away with this man, which is, they're saying the same thing. And part of this leads to, I'll get to that in a second. One of the things to recognize about and to remember about the figure of Paul, of him as sort of a speaker and a teacher and a preacher, however you want to characterize him, that throughout, this isn't the only time that people stand and listen, and they have, varying responses. We've read 3 other addresses earlier on in Acts, and this is one of the longer ones, like 21 verses or so of just him talking the whole way through, which we don't get very often. Usually there's some sort of break or a conversation, whether it be one of Peter's discourses or Paul's or Jesus' own teachings too. But this is a pretty long sermon, effectively, or a testimony, rather, that Paul gives. And of course we see, again, Paul is, brutally honest and sincere and vulnerable about sort of who he is and what he has been and what he has done. And of course that's, at the forefront before he even goes to Jerusalem, and he has this moment of like, they're probably going to remember that it was me, persecuting all them in the synagogues, but I'm going to go anyway because God has told him to go. So again, remarkable faithfulness. And one of the takeaways from Paul's particular witness is this sort of a concept of a theology of martyrdom and this willingness to suffer for the cross, to suffer for Christ, and that he faces all this willingly. And of course, that is a parallel with Christ's own willingness to suffer ultimate death too.
Big lightning.
Well, that's very exciting. I don't know what that means by what I just said too, but I'm not sure what I said, but hopefully it was good. Paul's suffering. We're all suffering from the thunderstorm that's about to hit this building. Oh, there's going to be another one. It wasn't? Okay. What a tease. Well, I didn't hear it. What a tease. Okay, anyway. I didn't hear it. Okay. There it goes. So his trials mirror Jesus' own too. There's betrayal, false accusations, and unjust treatment. He gets punched, a couple times, which is kind of humorous to see. I find it a little bit humorous, reading, just sort of picturing the scenario. But through, Paul comments on this throughout some of his epistles, but especially in Colossians, that there's something redemptive about sharing in the suffering for the faith that Christ, of course, did himself, and any time we do, is something similar. And of course, from the very beginning, early Christians, held, martyrdom, the idea of dying for one's faith, as this tremendous honor to get to share in the same witness that Christ gave to us. There's more light. The light is very distracting to me now, too. And so one of the takeaways for us, even today, even in a pretty safe area of North Texas, and still fully entrenched in the Bible Belt, is knowing that we have a Christian task, which is to preach Christ crucified and the faith that God has given us, despite what people may or may not say or do. And of course, to trust in God's plan along the way. One of the other ways to read this that I think is helpful to remember is that it starts with Paul simply sharing his own life. He's literally giving his own testimony. And of course, he has a pretty remarkable one. He has this incredible change of his whole life and himself. Goes from the most intense persecutor of Christians to the biggest leader, or the biggest you could say a lot about it. The biggest witness for the Christian faith. And of course has a tremendous impact on shaping Christianity forever through all of his letters. We see Paul continually trusting in God's plan and saying, I'm going to do this. I understand the risk. We also have this tremendous gift that Paul gets to share with us, that he has this moment where the risen Lord meets him and gives him this encouragement, which is this beautiful, beautiful gift, and something that we can put our own hope in too. All the while, we see him kind of being somewhat crafty and quick on his feet to sort of navigate some of these tricky situations, which of course, the best one is when he's getting beaten up and he turns to the guy, he's like, I'm a Roman citizen? And he's like, oh, sorry, I should have checked that, I forgot to ask that question, which seems like a kind of obvious one, but yet, one, it's a great blessing that he was a Roman citizen. Yeah.
So I think I know why Paul was a citizen, because his father had citizenship or something like that.
Yes.
And it is to him.
Yes.
But how many other disciples were Roman?
Oh, that's a great question.
I thought Matthew might be, because he was a tax collector, but I don't know. I'm asking.
No, but Matthew was raised a Jew.
Yeah, he was hired by the Jews.
Right, that's a good question.
Well, if you're born in a Roman province and you've done something
Right.
worthy, they would give you citizenship, right?
I would think, that's my understanding. I'm no Roman citizenship expert, and I wish I did.
How did they know he was telling the truth?
I don't think so.
That's also a good question.
Did you want to chance it? What they were?
Equally plausible, and part, of course, the tension of the story is that, the mob is, not exactly, calm, right? Even the text makes a mention of they're kicking up dust in the air. You can get this image that they're really, really worked up. And of course, no one wants a riot on their hands. So I'm sure they were happy to sort of quiet that down. And of course, they respond with great earnestness when they hear about the Okay, I've got one more slide. We're about to wrap it up, I promise. This is so we got
GTP says Paul was the only Roman citizen.
Oh, okay, that's right.
That Paul was the only Roman citizen from ChatGPT.
Which I think makes sense.
Of the apostles.
I think that
Of
makes
the
sense.
apostles.
Yeah.
Well, but was Paul an apostle?
No, Paul doesn't get counted as an apostle.
See, I didn't think so.
No.
No.
I mean,
Yeah,
he's
but
like the closest, half a step removed,
He's a
right?
disciple, but not an
Yeah.
apostle.
Well, the way I asked the question, I said, how many of the apostles were Roman citizens? And the answer was Paul.
That's China telling you that.
This is
Just kidding, just kidding. Just kidding, I'm kidding.
to me.
I think that is the last one. Okay. I had something else to say, but now it's gone now. But by the lightning. The last thing I'll say, recognizing the whole sequence is, Paul's throughout. We've seen his whole the life that is documented to us. Remarkably faithful and sincere in responding to God's call on his life over and over and over. He's humble when he's supposed to be. If you remember, when he mentions, part of his testimony, he mentions training under the Rabbi Gamaliel, both under him and then when he spends time with the Christians, he spends like several years in his own discipleship where he's being discipled himself, which of course is a model for us, for all of us, to be humble, to receive the faith sincerely, but also being patient to receive it slowly too, because you can't learn it in a day. Even Paul, this incredibly studious, well-read person himself, spends several years learning the Christian faith too. All the while, God is still in control, so thanks be to God for that. All right, any other thoughts or comments before the thunderstorm gets all of us? Yes, Greg.
Did I hear you say something earlier about what happened to the 40 men who took the vow?
I just mentioned that, there was this group. I had the thought as I was reading it today, I was like, they took this vow and they were thwarted, So did
They
they...
starved to death?
Right, at some point, I'm sure one of them was like, okay, I'm going to go eat a sandwich, That would be my guess. I'm sure some church father has their own
I'm sorry,
opinion.
I thought I heard you say they were the guys who ended up saving him, but no.
No. Oh, the one of the last ones I had, seeing how Rome was so quick to sort of dispel the mob, and to see how quickly they responded with sort of an overly generous amount of protection, right? They don't just send along with 100 soldiers, it's 400 to 500 to 1,000 people, right? That are really trying to protect him, which I think is notable. Okay, any other thoughts? And then we'll get out before the thunderstorm swoops us all away. All right, let's end up and have a prayer, and then we'll get going.